The dust kicked up behind his horse as Ben Morrison rode into Cedar Ridge, Texas. It was 1878, and the sun was setting behind the wooden buildings that lined the main street. Ben was a giant of a man, 6 feet 8 inches tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sky. His hands were the size of dinner plates and his boots were custom-made because no store carried his size. People stopped what they were doing when they saw him. Women pulled their children closer. Men stepped aside on the wooden sidewalks. It wasn't that Ben was mean or dangerous. He had never hurt an innocent person in his life. But when you're that big, people notice, they remember, and they stay out of your way. Ben had been riding from town to town for 13 years now, ever since the war ended. He had fought for the Union Army, seen things that no man should see, and lost people he loved. The war had ended, but the fighting inside. His head never stopped, so he kept moving, driving cattle from ranch to ranch, never staying in one place too long. His horse, a strong brown mare named Rosie, was tired. She had carried Ben for 3 days straight, and both of them needed rest. Ben pulled up in front of the Cedar Ridge Hotel, a 2-story building with peeling paint and crooked shutters. It wasn't fancy, but it would do. The hotel clerk was a nervous young man with thin hair and shaking hands. He looked up at Ben and his eyes went wide. How can I help you, sir?" "Need a room for the night," Ben said in his deep voice, "and a place for my horse." "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." The clerk fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before managing to hand Ben a room key. "Room 7, upstairs. The stable is around back." Ben paid for the room and walked Rosie to the stable. The stable boy, who couldn't have been more than 14, took one look at Ben and ran to get the stable master. "Don't worry about the boy," said an older man who came out wiping his hands on a dirty cloth. "He's just never seen anyone quite so big. I'm Tom. I run this place." Ben nodded. "Ben Morrison. Take good care of her. She's been working hard." Tom looked at Rosie and then back at Ben. "You're a cattle driver?" "That's right. We don't get many through here anymore. Most of the big drives go around us now." Ben shrugged. "I go where the work is." After making sure Rosie had fresh water and oats, Ben walked back to the hotel. The dining room was small and dimly lit, with only a few other guests eating their supper. Ben ordered beef stew and cornbread, sitting at a table in the corner where he could see the whole room. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, brought his food. "You passing through?" she asked. "Yeah, just collecting payment for a cattle delivery. Should be gone by tomorrow afternoon." She nodded and started to walk away, then turned back. "Word of advice? Stay away from the town square tomorrow morning. There's going to be trouble, and a man your size, well, people might expect you to pick a side." Ben looked up from his stew. "What kind of trouble?" The woman glanced around the room, then leaned closer and lowered her voice. "There's going to be an auction, but it's not cattle or horses they're selling." She straightened up and walked away before Ben could ask any more questions. That night, Ben lay in the small hotel bed, his feet hanging over the end. The mattress creaked under his weight, and the walls were thin enough that he could hear every sound from the street below. He thought about what the waitress had said, an auction that wasn't for cattle or horses. In his 13 years of traveling, Ben had learned that sometimes it was better not to ask too many questions. Every town had its secrets, its problems, its darkness. He had learned to keep his head down and move on. But something about the woman's tone bothered him. The way she had looked around the room before speaking. The warning to stay away. Ben had seen that look before during the war. It was the look of someone who knew something terrible was about to happen, but felt powerless to stop it. He thought about his sister Lucy. She had been just 8 years old when she died during the war. Not from bullets or cannons, but from sickness and hunger when their town was under siege. Ben had been away fighting, unable to protect her. He carried that guilt with him everywhere he went. The next morning, Ben woke early and went downstairs for breakfast. The dining room was quieter than usual, and the few people there spoke in whispers. The same waitress from the night before brought him coffee and eggs. "You still planning to leave today?" she asked. "After I collect my payment, yes. She nodded, but Ben could see worry in her eyes. The bank opens at 9. You might want to get your business done early. Ben finished his breakfast and walked outside. The morning air was cool, and the streets were surprisingly empty for a town this size. Most of the shops were closed, and the few people he saw hurried along with their heads down. He made his way to the bank, a solid brick building on the corner of Main Street and First Avenue. The banker, a well-dressed man with a gray beard, was expecting him. "Mr. Morrison?" Yes, we have your payment ready. Excellent work on that cattle drive. No losses delivered on time. Very impressive." Ben signed the papers and counted his money. It was a good payment, enough to keep him going for several months if he was careful. As he folded the bills and put them in his leather pouch, he heard voices outside. Loud voices. "What's all the noise about?" Ben asked. The banker's face darkened. "Town business. Nothing that concerns you, I'm sure." But something in the man's tone told Ben otherwise. He thanked the banker and stepped outside. A crowd was gathering in the town square about 2 blocks away. Ben could see people walking in that direction, and he could hear voices getting louder. His plan was to go back to the hotel, get Rosie, and ride out of town. That had always been his plan. Keep moving, don't get involved, don't make connections that could be broken. It was safer that way, easier. But as he started walking back toward the hotel, he heard something that made him stop. It was a sound he recognized from the war, the sound of fear, real, desperate fear. Ben Morrison had spent 13 years running from his past, running from his guilt, running from the memory of a little girl he couldn't save. He had convinced himself that staying uninvolved was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But as he stood there in the dusty street of Cedar Ridge, Texas, listening to that sound of fear coming from the town square, Ben realized that sometimes running away isn't an option. Sometimes, no matter how much you want to avoid trouble, trouble finds you anyway. And sometimes, just sometimes, you have to stop running and face whatever is waiting for you in that town square. Ben looked back toward the hotel, then toward the growing crowd. His horse was ready. His money was in his pocket. The road out of town was clear, but his feet started walking toward the square. He told himself he was just curious. Just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. He wasn't going to get involved. He was just going to look, then leave. But deep down, Ben Morrison knew he was lying to himself. Something was about to happen in that town square. Something that would change everything. And for the first time in 13 years, he wasn't going to run away. The crowd in the town square was bigger than Ben had expected. At least 50 people stood around a wooden platform that had been set up near the old oak tree. Men in dusty work clothes, women with sun-worn faces, and even some children who should have been in school. But what struck Ben most was how quiet everyone was. This wasn't the excited chatter of a normal auction. This was the heavy silence of people who knew they were about to witness something wrong. Ben pushed through the crowd, using his size to move people aside without being rude about it. As he got closer to the front, he could see the platform more clearly. There was a man standing on it, thin, with greasy hair and a suit that had seen better days. He was talking to someone Ben couldn't see yet. "Now, folks, I know some of you have questions about this," the man was saying. "But everything we're doing here today is completely legal. This child owes a debt, and debts must be paid. That's how society works." Ben felt his stomach drop. A child? He pushed forward until he was near the front of the crowd. And then he saw her. She was sitting on a wooden crate at the edge of the platform. Maybe 8 years old, with brown hair that hadn't been brushed in days, and a dress that was too big for her small frame. Her hands were tied in front of her with rope, and her eyes were red from crying. But what hit Ben like a punch to the gut was the look on her face. It was the same look his sister Lucy had worn during those last days of the war. Pure, helpless terror. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man continued, "this is little Molly Patterson. Her father, as you all know, was quite the gambling man. Unfortunately, he passed away last month owing significant debts to several prominent members of our community. The child has no family, no means of support, and these debts must be satisfied. Ben's hands clenched into fists. He had heard about things like this happening in remote towns where the law was weak and corrupt men took advantage. But seeing it with his own eyes was different. This wasn't just wrong. It was evil. Now, the arrangement is simple, the man went on. Whoever purchases Miss Patterson's debt will have the right to her labor until the debt is fully paid. That's estimated to be, about 12 to 15 years, depending on how hard she works. 12 to 15 years. The girl would be a grown woman by then, if she survived at all. Ben looked around the crowd, expecting to see outrage, expecting people to speak up, but most of them just stared at the ground. A few men were actually nodding as if this made perfect sense to them. "Where's the sheriff?" Ben asked the man standing next to him. The man glanced up at Ben's towering frame and pointed toward the back of the crowd. "Right there, Sheriff Williams." Ben spotted the sheriff, a heavy-set man with a badge pinned to his vest. He was talking, quietly with two other men, and all three of them were smiling. Ben realized with growing anger that the sheriff wasn't here to stop this. He was here to make sure it happened. "Now then," the auctioneer continued, "let's start the bidding at $50. A man near the front raised his hand. 50. I hear 50. Do I hear 60? Another hand went up. 60. Ben watched in horror as the price went higher. $75. 100. 125. These people were bidding on a child as if she were a piece of property, and the little girl just sat there, watching her fate being decided by strangers. 150, called out a voice from the back. Ben turned to see who had bid. It was a man he recognized from the hotel, well-dressed with cold eyes and hands that had never done an honest day's work. Ben had seen men like him during the war, men who got rich while others suffered. "I hear 150. Do I hear 175? The bidding continued, and Ben felt rage building in his chest like a wildfire. These people weren't just stealing this child's freedom, they were stealing her life. 12 to 15 years of unpaid labor would break her spirit, if it didn't kill her first. He thought about Lucy again, about how she had looked at him with such trust, believing that her big brother would always protect her, about how he had failed her when she needed him most. $200, someone shouted. The crowd murmured. $200 was serious money in 1878. That would buy a good horse or 3 months' worth of supplies. 200? Going once. Ben's heart was pounding. The little girl's eyes found his across the crowd, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. She wasn't crying anymore. She just looked at him with that same trusting expression Lucy had worn, as if she somehow knew he was different from the others, as if she believed he might help her. Going twice. Ben's hand went to the leather pouch, in his pocket. His cattle-driving money. 6 months of hard work across dangerous territory. Enough to buy his own small ranch and finally settle down somewhere. His entire future was in that pouch. But looking at that little girl, Ben realized his future didn't matter. Nothing mattered except stopping this nightmare. $200 going through— Wait. Ben's voice cut through the air like thunder. The entire crowd turned to look at him. The auctioneer squinted in his direction, trying to see who had spoken. "I said wait," Ben repeated, stepping forward. People moved aside as he approached the platform. With each step he felt calmer, more certain. For the first time in 13 years, he knew exactly what he needed to do. The auctioneer looked nervous as Ben approached. "Sir, if you want to bid, you need to— I want to see the legal papers," Ben said in a voice that carried across the entire square. "Show me the documents that prove this child owes any debt at all." "Now see here," the auctioneer sputtered. "This is a legal proceeding. You can't just— Show me the papers." Ben was now standing directly in front of the platform, close enough that the auctioneer had to crane his neck to look up at him. "Show me a court order. Show me a judge's signature. Show me anything that proves what you're doing here is legal." The crowd began to murmur. Some people started pushing forward to hear better. Others began backing away, sensing that trouble was coming. "Sheriff!" the auctioneer called out. "Sheriff Williams, we have a disruption here." The sheriff pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on his gun. But when he saw Ben, all 6 feet 8 inches of him, the sheriff hesitated. "What's the problem here?" Sheriff Williams asked, but his voice lacked confidence. Ben turned to face him. "The problem is that slavery was abolished 13 years ago. The problem is that you can't sell human beings in the United States of America. And the problem is that I don't think any of this is legal at all." The sheriff's face went red. "Now, you listen here, stranger. This child owes a legitimate debt, and to who?" Ben interrupted. "Show me the creditors. Show me the paperwork. Show me one single legal document that justifies what's happening here." The sheriff looked at the auctioneer. The auctioneer looked at the well-dressed man who had bid $200. None of them had an answer, because Ben was right, and everyone in that square knew it. This wasn't about debt. This wasn't about law. This was about powerful men taking advantage of a helpless child because they thought no one would stop them. But Ben Morrison was about to prove them wrong. The little girl was still watching him, still believing, still trusting that this giant, stranger might somehow save her, and Ben was not going to let her down. Not this time, never again. The silence in the town square was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Ben stood facing the sheriff, the auctioneer, and now 3 other men who had pushed their way to the front of the crowd. These weren't ordinary townspeople. They wore expensive clothes and had the soft hands of men who made their money from other people's work. "You're making a big mistake, stranger," said the well-dressed man who had bid $200. His name was Silas Crenshaw, and he owned the biggest store in town, plus several other businesses. "This is none of your concern." Ben looked down at him. Crenshaw was a full foot shorter than Ben and probably weighed half as much. "When I see a child being sold like cattle, it becomes my concern." "Nobody's being sold," Crenshaw snapped. "This is about debt collection. Perfectly legal." "Debt collection? Then show me the debt," Ben said calmly. "Show me the contract that says an 8-year-old girl is responsible for her father's gambling losses." "The law is clear," Sheriff Williams said, though he was staying well out of Ben's reach. "When a man dies owing money, his property—" "She's not property," Ben interrupted, his voice getting louder. "She's a child, a human being, and you know as well as I do that children can't be held responsible for their parents' debts." The crowd was getting restless. Some people were nodding in agreement with Ben. Others were looking uncomfortable, as if they were seeing this situation clearly for the first time. A few women had tears in their eyes as they looked at little Molly still sitting on that wooden crate, watching this adult argument that would decide her fate. "Listen here, you oversized saddle tramp," Crenshaw said, his face turning red with anger. "This town has been handling its business just fine without interference from drifters. You'd best mount up and ride out while you still can." Ben smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Crenshaw?" "I'm warning you," Crenshaw replied. "You're outnumbered here." Ben looked around the square. Crenshaw was right about that. There were at least a dozen men who worked for Crenshaw or owed him money. The sheriff had 3 deputies who had now pushed their way to the front, and plenty of other townspeople who might side with the local businessmen against a stranger. But Ben had learned a few things during his years as a soldier. The most important lesson was that being outnumbered didn't matter if you were fighting for the right cause, and if you were big enough to make people think twice about starting a fight. "Sheriff," Ben said, never taking his eyes off Crenshaw, "I want to see the paperwork for this auction. All of it. The court orders, the legal notices, the documentation of the debt. Everything." "I don't have to show you anything," Williams replied. "Yes, you do," Ben said, "because I'm formally challenging the legality of these proceedings, and as a citizen of the United States, I have the right to see any legal documents being used to justify the sale of a human being." This was a bluff, but Ben was counting on the fact that most of these men didn't know much about the law beyond what served their interests, and he was right. Williams and Crenshaw exchanged worried glances. "The paperwork is back at my office," Williams said finally. "Then let's go get it," Ben replied. "All of us. Right now." "We're not going anywhere," Crenshaw said. "This auction is happening today, as scheduled." Ben took a step closer to the platform. "No, it's not. One of Crenshaw's men, a big fellow named Pete who worked as an enforcer for the store owner, moved to block Ben's path. Pete was large by normal standards, probably 6 feet tall and 200 pounds of muscle. But next to Ben, he looked like a child. "You heard Mr. Crenshaw," Pete said. "Time for you to leave." Ben looked down at him. "Move aside, son. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I'm not leaving without that little girl." Pete reached for the knife on his belt. It was a mistake. Ben's hand shot out faster than anyone expected and grabbed Pete's wrist. There was a cracking sound, and Pete screamed as the knife fell to the ground. Ben hadn't even put much effort into it, but Pete was a lot smaller and weaker than the wild animals and difficult cattle Ben dealt with every day. "Anyone else?" Ben asked calmly, still holding Pete's wrist. Pete was on his knees now, whimpering. The other men backed away. Sheriff Williams reached for his gun, but Ben fixed him with a stare that made him freeze. "Sheriff, I strongly suggest you don't draw that weapon," Ben said. "Because if you do, you'd better be prepared to use it. And if you use it, you'd better not miss. Because I promise you won't get a second chance." Williams' hand stopped moving toward his gun. Ben could see the fear in his eyes. The sheriff was a bully who was used to intimidating people with his badge and his gun, but he had never faced anyone like Ben Morrison. "This is kidnapping," Crenshaw shouted. "You can't just take the girl." "I'm not taking her," Ben said, finally releasing Pete's wrist. The man scrambled away, holding his injured arm. "I'm buying her freedom." Ben reached into his leather pouch and pulled out all his money. 6 months of wages. His entire future. He threw the bundle of bills onto the platform where it landed with a thud. $300, he announced. "That's more than anyone else has bid. According to your own rules, that makes me the highest bidder." The crowd gasped. $300 was more money than most of them saw in a year. Crenshaw stared at the money, his eyes wide with greed and surprise. You can't just," Crenshaw stammered. "I just did," Ben said. "You wanted to sell her debt? Fine, I'm buying it, all of it. Whatever her father owed, it's paid now with interest." Ben turned to the auctioneer, who was looking very nervous. "Well, are you going to accept my bid or not?" The auctioneer looked at Crenshaw, then at the sheriff, then at the money on the platform. $300 it's the highest bid. Then the auction is over," Ben said. He climbed up onto the platform in one easy step. The whole structure shook under his weight, but it held. Little Molly looked up at him with wide eyes as he knelt down beside her. "It's okay," he said gently. "I'm going to get you out of here." Ben carefully untied the ropes around her wrists. Her hands were red and raw where the rope had rubbed against her skin. When she was free, she didn't run or cry. She just looked at him with those trusting eyes and whispered, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Ben said quietly. "We're not out of trouble." He was right. Crenshaw was talking urgently to the sheriff and his deputies. Other men in the crowd were looking angry and confused. Ben realized that even though he had legally won the auction, these people weren't going to let him just walk away with the girl. Ben stood up and faced the crowd, keeping Molly behind him. "The auction is over," he said loudly. "The girl's debt is paid. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with the federal authorities." "This isn't over, stranger," Crenshaw said. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." Ben picked up his money from the platform and put it back in his pouch, except for $300, which he handed to the auctioneer. "Consider the debt paid in full," he said. Then he turned to Molly. "Can you walk, sweetheart?" She nodded. "Good. Stay close to me. We're leaving now." As Ben climbed down from the platform with Molly beside him, he could feel the hostility from the crowd. These people weren't going to just let this go. Crenshaw and his men would try to stop them before they got out of town. But Ben Morrison had made his choice. He had spent 13 years running from his past, running from his guilt, running from his responsibility to protect the innocent. Today that running stopped. Today he was going to stand and fight, and heaven help anyone who tried to stop him from getting this little girl to safety. Ben walked slowly through the crowd with Molly's small hand in his. People stepped aside, but he could feel their eyes on him. Some looked angry, some looked confused. A few looked relieved, as if they were glad someone had finally stood up to Crenshaw and his corrupt friends. But Ben knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "Hold on there," Sheriff Williams called out. "You can't just walk away." Ben stopped and turned around, gently positioning Molly behind him. "Why not? I paid the money. The auction is over." "There are procedures," Williams said, walking closer with his 3 deputies. "Paperwork that needs to be filed. Officials that need to be notified." "Fine," Ben said. "We'll wait right here while you go get the paperwork." Williams looked frustrated. It was clear he was stalling, trying to figure out how to stop Ben without looking like the corrupt lawman he really was. Crenshaw pushed forward through the crowd. "Sheriff, this man is clearly not from around here. How do we know that money is even real? How do we know he didn't steal it?" Ben's jaw tightened. "Are you calling me a thief?" "I'm saying we don't know anything about you," Crenshaw replied. "For all we know, you could be an outlaw. Maybe we should lock you up until we can verify your identity." The crowd murmured. Some people nodded as if this made sense to them. Ben realized that Crenshaw was cleverer than he had first thought. The man was trying to turn the townspeople against him by making them suspicious and afraid. "My name is Ben Morrison," Ben said loudly so everyone could hear. "I fought for the Union Army during the war. I've been driving cattle for 13 years, and I've never broken the law in my life. That money came from an honest job, delivering cattle, to a ranch outside of Austin. I can give you the name of every man I worked with." "That's what you say," one of Crenshaw's men called out. "But we only have your word for it." Ben felt Molly's hand tighten in his. She was scared, and he didn't blame her. The situation was getting more dangerous by the minute. "Tell you what," Ben said, thinking fast. "The bank manager just paid me this morning. He can verify where the money came from." "The bank is closed for lunch," Williams said quickly. "Then we'll wait for it to open," Ben replied. "Can't do that," Williams said. "If there's a question about the legality of this transaction, I have to take the child back into custody until it's resolved." Ben's eyes went cold. "No one is taking this child anywhere." "Are you threatening a lawman?" one of the deputies asked, his hand moving toward his gun. "I'm stating a fact," Ben said calmly. "I paid the money fair and square. The girl's debt is cleared, and I'm not letting anyone put her back on that auction block." The tension in the square was thick enough to cut. Ben could see that some of the townspeople were getting nervous. A few had started backing away, sensing that violence might be coming. Then, unexpectedly, help came from an unlikely source. "Excuse me," said a voice from the back of the crowd. "Excuse me, please." People turned to see who was speaking. It was the waitress from the hotel, the woman who had warned Ben about the auction. She was pushing her way through the crowd, and she looked determined. "My name is Helen McCarthy," she said when she reached the front. "I've lived in this town for 20 years, and I think everyone here knows I'm an honest woman." Several people nodded. Crenshaw looked annoyed. "Helen, this is not the time for—" "This is exactly the time," Helen interrupted. "Because I knew Molly's father, and I know the truth about his so-called debts." The crowd went quiet. Even Crenshaw stopped talking. "Tom Patterson wasn't a gambling man," Helen continued. "He was a farmer who worked harder than anyone in this county. He only got into debt because his crops failed 2 years running, and he had to borrow money to keep food on the table for his daughter." "That's not," Crenshaw started to say. "I'm not finished," Helen said firmly. "Tom paid back every penny he borrowed for food and supplies. The only debt he had when he died was the money he owed Dr. Williams for trying to save his wife when she got sick. And Dr. Williams forgave that debt before Tom was even buried." Ben felt a surge of hope. This woman was backing up what he had suspected all along, that there was no real debt. This whole auction was just Crenshaw's way of getting free labor. "She's lying," Crenshaw shouted. "Tom Patterson owed money to several businesses in town, including mine." "For what?" Helen demanded. "Tom Patterson never bought anything from your store that he didn't pay for in cash. I should know. I helped him with his books for the last 2 years of his life." More people in the crowd were nodding now. Ben could see that Helen's words were having an effect. These people had known Tom Patterson. They knew what kind of man he was. "This is ridiculous," Sheriff Williams said. "We can't make legal decisions based on gossip and rumors." "You're right," said another voice. This time it was Dr. Williams, the sheriff's own brother, and the man Helen had mentioned. He was an older man with gray hair and kind eyes. "We can't make decisions based on rumors. We should make them based on facts." The doctor walked through the crowd until he was standing next to Helen. "Tom Patterson owed me $67 when he died. I forgave that debt and wrote it off in my books. As far as I know, that was the only money Tom owed to anyone in this town." "That's not true," Crenshaw insisted. "He owed money to who?" Dr. Williams asked. "Show us the contracts. Show us the IOUs. Show us any proof at all that Tom Patterson owed money to anyone except me." Crenshaw's face was getting redder by the minute. "I don't have to prove anything to you people." "Actually, you do," said another voice. This one belonged to Judge Harrison, an elderly man who had just arrived at the square. "If you're going to sell a child to pay debts, you need to prove those debts exist." Ben had never been so happy to see a judge in his life. Judge Harrison was well respected throughout the county, and even Crenshaw couldn't argue with him. "Judge Harrison," Crenshaw said, trying to sound reasonable, "this is a simple matter of debt collection. The proper procedures have been followed." "Have they?" the judge asked. "Because I don't recall approving any auction for the sale of a minor child. In fact, I don't recall being notified about this at all." Sheriff Williams was looking very uncomfortable now. We thought it was a civil matter that didn't require court involvement." "Selling a child always requires court involvement," Judge Harrison said sternly. "And it requires proof of legal guardianship, proof of debt, and approval from the county, none of which appears to have happened here." Ben felt relief washing over him. The judge was taking his side, but he also knew that Crenshaw and Williams weren't going to give up easily. "Even if there are procedural irregularities," Crenshaw said, "the fact remains that this stranger has no legal right to take custody of the child." "That's true," Judge Harrison said, and Ben's heart sank. "But neither do you, Mr. Crenshaw. If Tom Patterson died without family and without debts, then Molly becomes a ward of the county until proper placement can be arranged." Ben felt Molly's hand squeeze his tighter. He looked down at her and saw fear in her eyes again. Being made a ward of the county might be better than being sold to Crenshaw, but it still meant she would be taken away from him. "However," the judge continued, "if someone were willing to formally adopt the child and if they could demonstrate their ability to provide proper care, that would be the preferable solution." Ben's heart started beating faster. "What would that require?" "A formal petition to the court," Judge Harrison said. "Character references, proof of income and stable housing, and a period of evaluation to ensure the arrangement is in the child's best interests." "I'll do it," Ben said immediately. "Whatever it takes." "It's not that simple," Crenshaw said. "This man is a drifter. He has no home, no permanent address. He's not suitable to raise a child." "He's more suitable than you are," Helen said firmly. "At least he's not trying to buy her like a piece of livestock." The crowd was clearly on Ben's side now. Even some of Crenshaw's own men were looking uncomfortable with what their boss had tried to do. "Judge," Ben said, "I know I don't have much to offer, but I have honest work, and I have money saved up. I can provide for her, and I swear to you I will never let anyone hurt this child." Judge Harrison looked at Ben for a long moment, then down at Molly. "What do you say, young lady? Would you like to go with Mr. Morrison?" Molly looked up at Ben, then at the judge. Her voice was small but clear when she spoke. "Yes, sir, please." The judge nodded. "Very well. I'm granting temporary custody to Mr. Morrison, pending a formal hearing next month. Sheriff Williams, you will prepare all the necessary paperwork and ensure that proper procedures are followed from now on." "But Judge," Crenshaw started to protest. "The matter is closed, Mr. Crenshaw," Judge Harrison said firmly. "And I suggest you be very careful about any future business dealings involving children. The county will be watching." Ben felt like a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but he also knew that he had just committed to something that would change his entire life. He was no longer a drifting cattle driver with no responsibilities. He was now responsible for a little girl who had already been through more trauma than any child should have to face. As the crowd began to break up, Ben knelt down beside Molly. "Are you okay with this, sweetheart? Are you sure you want to come with me?" She nodded solemnly. "You saved me," she said quietly. "You're the only one who tried to hell." 6 months later, the sound of hammering echoed across the small valley outside Denver, Colorado. Ben wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at the cabin he was building. It wasn't much yet, just 3 rooms and a porch, but it was more of a home than he had ever imagined having. "Ben," Molly's voice called from the creek nearby. "Come see what I found." Ben smiled and set down his hammer. In the months since they had left Cedar Ridge, Molly had slowly transformed from a frightened, silent child into a curious, talkative little girl. She still had nightmares sometimes, and she still jumped when strangers approached too quickly. But she was healing. Ben walked over to where Molly was kneeling by the water's edge. She had found a smooth, round stone that was almost perfectly white. "Look how pretty it is," she said, holding it up to catch the sunlight. "That's beautiful," Ben agreed. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to put it on the shelf in my room," she said, "next to the other special things." Molly had started collecting what she called special things: rocks, flowers, interesting pieces of wood, anything that caught her eye. Ben had built her a shelf in her small bedroom where she could display her treasures. It was her way of making the cabin feel like home. "That sounds like a good plan," Ben said. "But right now, we should probably head back. Mrs. O'Brien will be here soon for your reading lesson." Mrs. O'Brien was their nearest neighbor, a widow who lived about 2 miles away. She had been a school teacher before her husband died, and she had volunteered to help teach Molly to read and write. Ben was grateful for her help because his own education was limited to what he had learned in the Army. As they walked back toward the cabin, Ben thought about how much his life had changed. After the hearing in Cedar Ridge, where Judge Harrison had made Molly's adoption official, Ben had decided that his days of drifting were over. He used the last of his savings to buy this small plot of land in Colorado, and he had been building their new life one board at a time. It wasn't easy. Ben had never raised a child before, and Molly had never had a real family. They were both learning as they went along. There were days when Ben felt completely lost, when he wondered if he was doing the right thing. But then Molly would smile at him or laugh at something silly he said, and he knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Ben," Molly said as they reached the cabin, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you help me that day? You didn't even know me." Ben had been wondering when she would ask this question. Molly was a smart girl, and he knew she had been thinking about that day in the town square. "Well," he said, sitting down on the porch steps and patting the spot next to him. "I had a little sister once. Her name was Lucy." Molly sat down beside him. She had heard him mention Lucy before, but he had never told her the whole story. "Lucy was about your age when she died during the war." Ben continued. "I was away fighting, and I couldn't protect her when she needed me most. I've felt bad about that for a very long time." "But that wasn't your fault," Molly said. "You were fighting in the war. You couldn't help it." Ben smiled sadly. "That's what people told me. But it didn't make me feel any better. I kept thinking that if I had been there, maybe I could have saved her." "Is that why you saved me? Because of Lucy?" Ben thought about this for a moment. "Partly," he said, "but also because it was the right thing to do. No child should be treated the way those men were treating you. And when I saw you sitting there, scared and alone, I knew I couldn't just walk away." Molly was quiet for a while, thinking about this. Then she said, "I'm glad you didn't walk away." "Me too," Ben said, putting his arm around her small shoulders. "Me too." That evening, after Mrs. O'Brien had finished Molly's lesson and gone home, Ben and Molly sat on the porch watching the sunset. It was their favorite time of day, when the work was done and they could just enjoy being together. "Ben," Molly said, What are we going to do when the cabin is finished? What do you mean? I mean, what kind of work will you do? You can't drive cattle anymore because you need to stay here with me. Ben had been thinking about the same thing. His carpentry skills had improved a lot while building the cabin, and several neighbors had asked him to help with projects around their farms. There was also talk of the town nearby needing someone to shoe horses and repair wagons. I've been thinking about that, he said. There's plenty of work around here for someone who's good with his hands. And I've been talking to Mr. Peterson about maybe raising some horses. He thinks there's good money in it, and I know horses. Pretty well. That sounds nice, Molly said. I like horses. I know you do. Maybe we'll get you your own horse someday when you're a little bigger. Molly's eyes lit up at this possibility. She had been learning to ride on Mrs. O'Brien's old mare, but the idea of having her own horse was exciting. Ben? She said again. Yes? Are you happy here? I mean, really happy? Ben looked down at her serious little face. It was such a grown-up question from such a young girl, but then Molly had been forced to grow up faster than she should have. I'm happier than I've been in a very long time, he said honestly. What about you? Are you happy? Yes, she said without hesitation. This is the best home I've ever had. Ben felt his throat tighten with emotion. Molly rarely talked about her life before that day in the town square, but he knew it hadn't been easy. Her father had done his best, but they had been poor and struggling, and after he died, she had been completely alone until Ben came along. I'm glad, he said. Because this is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. Forever? She asked. Forever, he promised. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ben thought about the strange path that had led him to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been a lonely drifter with no purpose beyond the next job. Now he was a father, a homeowner, and a member of a community. He had responsibilities and connections and a reason to get up every morning. It was scary sometimes. There were moments when he worried that he wasn't good enough, that he didn't know enough about raising a little girl. But then he remembered that day in the town square, when he had made the choice to stop running and start fighting for what was right. That choice had cost him everything he owned at the time, but it had given him something far more valuable in return. It had given him a family. 3 years later, a traveling photographer named William Hayes stopped at their small ranch outside Denver. He was documenting life in the Colorado Territory, taking pictures of interesting people and places to sell to newspapers back east. When he saw Ben, now a successful horse trainer and blacksmith, teaching Molly to ride a beautiful chestnut mare, he knew he had found something special. He asked if he could take their picture, and Ben agreed. The photograph showed a giant of a man standing next to a smiling 13-year-old girl. She was holding the reins of her horse, and both of them were looking directly at the camera with confidence and joy. It was a picture of two people who had found each other when they both needed it most. Hayes sold the photograph to several newspapers, along with the story of how Ben had rescued Molly from that auction block in Cedar Ridge. The story spread across the country, and Ben began receiving letters from people who had read about what he had done. Some of the letters were from other children who needed help. Some were from adults who wanted to thank him for standing up for what was right, and some were from people who wanted to visit their ranch and meet the giant cowboy who had shouted, "Don't touch her," and changed 2 lives forever. Ben never considered himself a hero. He was just a man who had made a choice when a choice needed to be made. But Molly knew better. She knew that heroes don't always wear badges or uniforms. Sometimes they're just ordinary people who decide to do extraordinary things when the moment calls for it. And sometimes, just sometimes, those extraordinary moments lead to the most ordinary and beautiful gift of all, a family.